there are several questions that have come up and in the chat, and I wanted to just be responsive to those of you who took the time to ask those questions. And I'm going to turn to Dr. Roberts here. One question that's asking about issues of gender, and I think that it hasn't been raised so far specifically here, is most of the workers engaged in domestic work or healthcare are actually women. Do you think that women are disproportionately affected more in comparison to men? If yes, what can be done to counter this? So Professor Walton, if you would kindly.
Thank you. Yeah, I see that question from Emma. Thank you. Yes, gender is obviously a significant dimension of what's happening. There is an interesting gender working group in terms of COVID-19. They've been paying attention, of course, to the infection rate of COVID, which has apparently been more significant for men. But of course, women are disproportionately represented in many of the front line of the healthcare workers. So 80% of nurses tend to be are female. In Canada, we have had the epicenter for the COVID-19 infection has primarily been in long-term care homes. And those long-term care homes are staffed by predominantly women and significant numbers of immigrant and racialized women. And we've had some very interesting cases in Quebec, for example, where we have had refugees who walked across the border at Roxham Road. So when Trump was bringing in he's a kind of was causing all the disruption in terms of the rights of asylum seekers, many of those individuals in the US walked across the border into Quebec, across unmanned points. Some of those workers, especially Haitian women, ended up finding work in some of the long-term care homes in Quebec. And in response, there's been huge public support to seek a fast-track asylum, but a regularization of those asylum seekers because of the work they have been doing in those frontline long-term care facilities. And so that's a very interesting example. If I may just take this moment to speak very quickly about the issues that are coming up in terms of issues of rights, and talking about, as Professor Face did, about integration and rights. And also, I really do want to kind of follow up on many of the speakers talking about the fact that we are witnessing in this turmoil, just south of the border to me, but also worldwide, the protests about Black Lives Matter. And that is an example of how it is not clear that when you are supposedly have the rights of citizenship, you don't actually get to access those rights. And so just as African-American communities are demanding that systemic racism be seriously taken to task through policy measures, I would say we can also see that quite clearly in terms of the experiences of internal migrant laborers within India, and that this issue of solidarity and rights and being able to demand that your state provides to you the basics and protects your life, that has not been clearly evident. And I think it highly reflects this issue of the complexity of seeking rights. It is not a binary. Citizenship is not a binary. As much as legal scholars might say you have it or you don't, the reality is you only get it if somebody recognizes you as having it. And you have to enforce that demand that you receive justice and protection, as is your right. And if the state bodies are not willing to do that, then you have to find ways to either protest, or you have to have advocacy networks work on your behalf. And so I think that's another issue that seemed to be coming up through many of the comments shared by the co-panelists.
Thank you very much for that. I will go ahead. There's a number of questions there. I want to perhaps go to Professor Face. There's several questions that were directed towards you. Let me take a look and see. I'll take this one here. Professor Faith, I would have a reservation on using the term forced migration in this case, they say, as probably there are conceptual differences with the classic one. Don't you think we could think about applying a different term in this regard? And I think this speaks to some of the legalistic ways in which people kind of categorize people when on the ground. I think that many of us would agree that everybody should be extended those same rights. Professor Faith, would you please comment? Unmute, please.
If we lived in an ideal world, of course, all citizen rights would be human rights. That would be the most ideal world we can think of. But it's not like that, of course. And I think that by using terms such as forced migration, not with respect to any kind of migration, but to migration where we know that people are not simply forced by political persecution or by generalized violence, but also by economic hardship, by kind of famines to move, I think then the term is more than justified. So I think that forced migration is an umbrella term, which does not apply to all kinds of migration, but to a significant part in between more voluntary labor migration and migration evolving out of generalized violence. And that's why I connected or perhaps used this term forced migration when I talked about asylum seekers from some African countries to destination countries such as Germany. And this kind of setup, I think, leads us to the point how do we address policy-wise the effects of rights and rightlessness? As Margaret Walton Roberts has pointed out, citizenship is not a binary. And I also said that, for example, Romanian migrants who should have the same rights as German workers do not have them because they cannot enforce them. But what is policy to do? And here I want to come back to something Mr. Bolongo said before. He mentioned the case of Italy, where the Italian government is considering to extend an amnesty to legalize many of the undocumented workers. And I, of course, would wholeheartedly agree so that rights can be extended to these workers. But what kind of solution is it? It always has these unintended consequences. And that's why I think we should be very humble and very critical at the same time towards such well-meant policies. Again, I think it's to be supported that amnesty and legalization take place. But in a country like Italy, or if it happened in Germany, it would not be a kind of a very far-reaching solution, because we have seen in countries like Italy, for example, but also in other European countries, many waves of legalization. And again, the same issues of undocumented workers and their rightlessness has come up. So in a way, there is a manifest function to grant rights, but the latent function is to avoid devising more comprehensive immigration policies. And I think that's the point. I think when we talk about public policies, and Mr. Nair has done that admirably, then the question for me is always, what kind of unintended effects do these policies have? I mean, there's not only a one-size-fits-all policy, there's also no panacea for these policies. And that's why I think we need to be, when we talk about policy recommendations here, especially those like me who are academic armchair, so to speak, policy advisors, should be very careful because we don't know about the unintended consequences of these policies.
Thank you for that. I'd just like to actually bring in Mr. Boakie Yaudom in terms of your raising the issue of forced labor, because I feel like there's many ways that we can describe these different categories, but I wanted to hear just if you wanted to weigh in, and also then hear back from Mr. Bolongo, who was referenced by Professor Faith. But I wanted to just get a quick check-in from you. Are we missing something here in the discussion by trying to, in some ways, maybe be overly concerned about the unintended consequences of some of these things, which I think is an important thing to raise. But I just wanted to check in with you, given what you were saying earlier.
Thank you, Professor. I think I also did mention about generations of forced migration in terms of the movement of Africans to the Western world during the slavery era, and some of the consequences that's ensued after that in terms of systemic racism and injustice that is currently we're currently seeing in the United States, police brutalities. But obviously, forced migration also would include people who are through means and circumstances beyond their control, be it economic or political, have been displaced and on the move and helping to maybe seek asylum in certain countries. I do believe that there should be some consideration to the circumstances surrounding the forced migration, and that I think cases should be looked at based on their merit. So on a case-by-case basis. In terms of unintended consequences, we are currently in a global pandemic, and I think we all agree that half of the global workforce are migrants. And even in the United States, there's been talk of food security, where we have lots of undocumented migrants that are working, to make sure that Americans have food on the table day in, day out. So with stuff like a global pandemic going on, I think that we need to be humbled and recognize the fact that we need each other, and that people need to be secured if we need to be secured and expect our daily meal on our table. We need to make sure that those people who are making that possible are secured in what they are doing and not being treated unfairly, not being having their human rights abused simply because of their status. I think and believe that such people do need some security in terms of their status, and also in terms of their economic base to ensure the food security of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we can, I'll now turn to Mr. Bolongo. If there's anything you wanted to add to what Professor Feist was saying, building on Professor Walton and Waki Yadom.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Well, I believe that solidarity should not be an empty word. No, we have to give stuff to solidarity, and solidarity in times of coronavirus outbreak means protecting the population, not protecting only the citizens. There's a huge difference between protecting the entire population and protecting the citizens. And if the direction is that of protecting the population, the entire population, in that case, even undocumented migrants, every migrant is included in the population. And solidarity needs that more attention, social attention, health attention should be given and granted to those undocumented migrants. So, and the documented ones are free. They are free to go back home if they desire to. They are free to get back to their home countries if they desire to. But we also what happened in many countries. I'm from Cameroon, for instance, and migrants from Cameroon during the up to now, when they go back home, or other countries such as Morocco, Tunisia. I mean, most of the countries, if migrants go back home, they have to obey to coercive confinement, quarantine. There's nothing to do about it. Now, this seems to be engine for the countries, those who contribute to the GDP through their remittances. They are considered as dangerous for the society, dangerous for the community, dangerous for the village. I heard one of the pilots saying that migrant going back home does not only go back to his country, but he goes back to his district and goes back to his village. In this case, they tend to be dangerous for their villages, their local communities, their district. So, and based on that, solidarity should be filled with substance. And the only substance in the presence of undocumented migrants is that of granting documents. Yes, I saw a question that was asking whether this amnesty, for instance, is the best solution on the long run. Yes, it might not be the best solution, but it is a solution because we have no further solution. You know, it is exactly like what we have with the coronavirus outbreak now, without in the absence of any other solution, the only way out was the policy of staying at home. There was no other solution. That was the best solution, and we all had to obey. So, in the presence of thousands and thousands of undocumented migrants, what should we do? Leave them continue living in the dwellings, in the townships? No. The only way out is to grant them documents so that they can be properly taken care of in terms of medical assistance if many of them happen to be positive to this disease, for instance. And I think that is our conviction, and that's the way out. The only thing is not that of saying they have to go back to their countries. No. It wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be possible. Many boundaries are still off now, no way to enter. And we believe as they contribute as well, in keeping the countries, the host countries, keeping them safe from in terms of food security, they have to be recognized as workers, as people, and they have to be granted documents. That's the only way out.
Thank you. I want to we have about 12 minutes left, and I wanted to give Professor Singh and Mr. Nair an opportunity also to weigh in on what the conversation is going. I know that there are a number of questions in the chat, which hopefully we will be able to access at the end of this with a recording. You can also copy paste it if you want to respond to those individual questions, but I also don't want to deviate too much from what we're talking about here specifically. So let's go in the order of Professor Kumar, if you would go first, and then we'll turn things over to Mr. Nair, and then perhaps just some closing remarks. You need to unmute.
Thank you. What I have actually gone through all the questions which have been raised, and so I would also try to give answers to some of the questions which are addressed to me. The government is, of course, preparing arrival database of migrants, but we have some idea about the migrants who are coming back, from which country they are coming, and with what kind of a background. But as I said, the problem is of unemployment. This is at present one of the biggest problems in India, and it has nothing to do with COVID. COVID has just increased that unemployment. But this is a continuing problem, and there is say explanation of why unemployment is so high, how the government policies have supported the corporates more, and it's more supply-driven kind of a government policy rather than increasing the demand. So on the demand side, government is not working. All these issues are there, and it's not the time actually to discuss that in detail. Mere skill mapping, I think, is not adequate. The government has to think about employment programs. And at this stage, I think there are two important things. One is expansion of work-related program. That's one. And the second is also income support to families. These two, I think the government has to emphasize on. Then I will come to the third one, is the food security aspect. I know that, say, those who are coming from, say, other countries, and the wages which are so low in India, so somebody participates in the rural works program and finds that the wages are just now have been raised just 20 rupees, and it is now around 200 rupees. 200 rupees will be some $2.50 or so. So that's not enough, and that doesn't meet the expectations of people. But at the same time, it's also not the minimum wages in this country. So what the government has to do is not just the expansion of employment programs, but also improving the quality of the employment program. And one way of improving the quality of employment program is to actually to raise the wages, to at least make it minimum wages in India. So I think then it will actually motivate people to engage in, if there is a work opportunity, to then engage in the works program. And as I said, works program have to be also in urban areas, and this is long, it's a demand of civil society groups, particularly Right to Food and Right to Work campaigns. Then the food security program, which at least ensures that people do not go hungry. And as we know, India suffers from chronic hunger problem, also massive malnutrition problem. So at this stage, what is important is to ensure that the food delivery is timely through the public distribution system, and all those who have been left out, and particularly those who are affected because of the biometric system, I said they are included. So for the time being, like for the first month, the government did away with the biometric system. If that can be extended, and also on a war footing basis, if they can include people, those who are left out. Now, one more thing which is very important at this stage, and which is also the requirements of the migrants who are coming from abroad, is the quality of quarantine. I think Professor Watson has already, Walton has spoken about that. So quality of quarantine, and also the public health services. Except Kerala and a few states, the public health services are in very bad shape. And at this stage, the way the private hospitals are exploiting people, it's so difficult for any common man, even general middle class people, to, if you have COVID, say infection, to go to any private hospital. And most of the beds are now in these private hospitals. They ask you for 5 lakh, 10 lakh rupees as deposit in the beginning. So if we have to fight with this, the pandemic, and ensure that people are not dying, and ensure that they are not affected by mass malnutrition, and to ensure that they have some sustenance. So at least these things have to be done by the state, and this can't be done by any civil society groups. Or even when I'm saying state, I include the local bodies, but the local bodies depend for resources on the central government and the state governments, and the local bodies also suffer from all those biases, the power structure, the way it is structured. So all those also keep in the local bodies. So I just can't romanticize local bodies. We have to be very clear about the ground realities, even in the local self-government. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singh. Let us go to Mr. Nair for any further thoughts on the conversation. And then what I'd like to do is then go around for all the panelists to take 30 seconds to just summarize some final thoughts. And forgive me for cutting you short in terms of time. I know that there's much to be discussed and continue to elaborate on. Mr. Nair.
Thank you, Professor Ali. Now, this is I'm glad that there has been a whole range of aspects that have been touched upon. So I will not perhaps overdo it, but I would look at it from 3 different elements. Reintegration, and I want to focus here on reintegration, because I think there is constantly this confusion between integration and reintegration. Think about this. Even before people have started coming back, there is a whole group of people who had their mindset on leaving. So in Pakistan, there were about 60,000 people who had got their visas and were ready to leave when COVID struck. The same in Bangladesh, a big number in India, and so on. Now, these people, when you get your visa on your passport and you're ready to leave the country, there is no question asked about a life back home. You know, it is about wanting to go and earn your livelihood in the country of destination where you plan to. Now, for these people, really, it's a huge drawback for wanting to do that, and now it's going to backfire on their perspectives, on their larger perspectives, both socially and economically. So with that in mind, then it's important to recognize that any reintegration has to be both at the social and at the economic level. How many people come back wondering whether they're going to be treated as the carriers of infection and therefore stigmatized and not being able to reintegrate properly in their communities? That is a big issue, and therefore there needs to be strong awareness generation in our respective communities. Now, I understand what Professor Bushranger says with regards to not romanticizing local governments and so on, but there is a role that they have to play, and we have to empower these local authorities to play that role in spreading information in the right way and the right form. When we talk about migrant workers, they're not just anybody. You know, whether it's an irregular migrant worker or a regular, they have skills, they have experiences, they have life experiences that people can learn from, that people, that governments, that countries, that communities can gain from. So within those experiences and those skills, how do we then recognize prior learning? Now, I agree with Professor Margaret Walton Roberts. This is certainly an issue when it comes to people who come back, their degrees, students now, not the degrees not recognized in India. Well, this is also the issue of people who do go from here with an MBBS degree, a medical doctor who ends up working as a taxi driver in the country of destination. So recognition of prior learning, upskilling, reskilling, issues pertaining to all aspects of skills. How do they move in the first place in terms of ensuring fair recruitment, and that when they come back, that these recruitment charges that they have paid do not lead them to further indebtedness, are all important aspects that need to be considered for reintegration. And I'll conclude with one final point, and that is this. I agree with Dr. Feist. Sometimes policies are not everything, but policies also leave a benchmark for governments to follow. Even in the work in terms of producing a policy has a lot of effort that goes into it. There's already a coordination that takes place when governments produce policies. Within those policies, you have acts, you have laws, and those acts and laws are important. One of the big issues that we are seeing is dilution of laws, the weakening of labor laws, the weakening of labor standards, and that shouldn't be allowed to happen. Because if that happens, that also leads to a bigger issue of a lack or a weakened regional coordination mechanism. And the regional coordination is going to be crucial for reintegration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that there are more questions that came in, some hands that are up. We are actually at the close of the hour and a half panel discussion, but I'd like to ask our various panelists to take just a little something, a little 20 to 30 seconds to comment and summarize if there's, so we'll begin with Professor Feist.
I feel very much enriched by this discussion, and thanks to the speakers and the questions. And one of the things I take away from this discussion is the term that when we talk about integration, we should really always ask integration into what? Because it's integration into families, you see it in remittances, it's integration in civil society organizations, I mean unions where you see it solidarity, it's integration in organizations like companies like the nursing homes Margaret Walton Roberts mentioned, and it's integration into a state. And I do think that when we talk about return, we should not simply talk about reintegration, because return always means that you've always been integrated into some kind of social unit. And I think they're multi-scalar. And the multiplicity and diversity of these social units into which we all, not only migrants, are embedded in, I think that's key to understanding the success of return. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Walton Roberts, please.
Yes, thank you. This has been a really rich discussion, and I'm most appreciative to those in the other members who have posted questions. I've been looking at the questions and trying to keep tabs. And I would just add, I mean, there have been a number of questions posed around issues of what Professor Pushpendra Kumar Singh has discussed. And I do wholeheartedly agree with his comments that we do need to see central governments invest in works programs. I'm also familiar with the MG Narega program and would concur that an urban example would also be useful. I would highlight, though, that there are some interesting research on that program in terms of the gender dimensions, and that we need to be conscious of how to incorporate women and other marginalized groups into those opportunities. And I wouldn't romanticize that level, that scale, but it is the closest to the community. And to be honest, even though research has indicated that program has significant leakage, there's always the concern about corruption. Corruption is everywhere. So why do we allow corruption at the highest scales to go on, and then we want to end the program because there's corruption in the scales closest to where people are? So there is a significant amount of work to be done to facilitate the return and integration of migrant workers. And hopefully what we can see is some advocacy and engagement to seriously look at the policy deficiencies that have emerged in the inability of states to understand what's happening and to find adequate solutions to even providing the barest minimum of livelihood protections at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Walton. We'll go to Mr. Bolongo.
Well, thank you. I would just say this. I'm afraid that the return of migrants would sound like a failure, during the coronavirus and even after the coronavirus outbreak. And that's why, being a migrant myself, I believe that every possible thing should be done in such a way that they could continue to live legally in their host country, because from their former position, I mean, people contributing to the welfare of their families, supporting their families, and just getting back home without anything, I'm afraid it might sound like a failure. And those migrants would be considered pariahs to the society. And maybe the best thing is to give them the opportunity and the possibility to continue to live in their home countries in legalized positions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Boakie-Yiadom.
Thank you, and thank you to my fellow speakers. I think this discussion has been very rich. My closing thoughts, I mean, there was a question on the, in the chats about going forward, what we anticipate in terms of irregular migration through the deserts, through the Mediterranean. And my comments will be that there needs to be more at the countries of origin. And that's what my organization, we've been trying to advocate for more economic initiatives in the communities that are more endemic to go on such migration trips. Another thing will also be for to advocate for access to information for migrant workers abroad. I think that's one very key thing, that you need timely and accurate access to information to make decisions that will enrich your life in terms of even return or reintegration. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Mr. Nair, please.
Thank you, Professor Ali. How do I conclude a session so rich? So I'll take a leaf out of my own personal life. My father was a migrant worker in the Middle East, which is where I grew up, and which is where he came back from 35 years after he left this country. When he came back voluntarily. He came back happy. He had retired from his work. He had built a house for himself. He had some bank savings. He could take care of his family and his only child, i.e. me. I was well settled. He still didn't know how to come back and live a life in the country that he called home, right? Therefore, any of these conversations that we're having, if we don't keep it centered on that worker, whether it's a man or a woman, a domestic worker, a construction worker, or a CEO. It doesn't matter. The priority should be focusing it and centering it around migrant workers. Let them be the center around which we have these discussions. That'll help us to only make it much more productive. Thank you.
Very much. And finally, Professor Bushranger.
Thank you, Prof. Ali. I would say that the government should bring back migrants, those who want to come back, and they had the earlier priority of bringing back on students, those who are on short-term visa or ill or pregnant women. Now they should see that the workers, those who want to come back or those who are in difficult circumstances, and even if they don't have money to pay for their ticket, they are brought back. The government should also share data about how many people have actually registered for coming back. And I would also say that we need to also focus on the plight of migrants in destination countries, and countries, sending countries collectively should also negotiate with the receiving countries so that there is support to our migrants. Then I would also say that, see, you look at the news which have come from Singapore, for example. Gulf we all know, but then the workers from Bangladesh or workers from India. Then I would say that we need to focus, because I'm talking about only the workers, we need to focus about work and quality of work. And finally, I've had nothing against the local self-government, and I'm all in favor of empowering them because they are closest to people. But what I was saying that we need to be very, very cautious that the pre-existing inequalities and discriminations and all fault lines are also addressed. Thank you.
Well, we've come to the end of this discussion, and I want to thank the panelists very much for this. There's many thanks that are appearing in the chat, and also questions that have not been answered. I know that we've been trying to respond to as many as possible. Thank you for those who are participating as listeners and who've submitted questions and comments. I'm very grateful also to Dr. Sen and Dr. Agarwal and the whole GRFD team for organizing this session. And I just wanted to say, as an American here of Indian heritage, my father's from India, my mother is from Peru, that I very much appreciated that Mr. Bwakwe Yadom was raising the issue of what's going on here in the United States. And I feel very inspired by the support internationally that has been offered to my fellow Americans here, Black Americans in particular, who have been struggling against this kind of oppression. And the great irony is that many of the police force are themselves African Americans, and so it's a very complicated situation that we are dealing with in the United States that goes back to slave patrols and oppression of the state. So I find that this discussion of looking at the most vulnerable people is very important. There are many struggles to be had, many challenges that we face internationally, globally. And I just wanted to express my sincere thanks and gratitude for those of you who've been in alliance with our efforts here to protest the victimization of Black people under the police. So thank you all very much. And again, I hope that we continue these kinds of discussions and we use the technology of Zoom. And I hope that you all have a good rest of the day wherever you are in the world. Have a good one. Take care, baby.
Thank you, sir.